So welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 4, Episode 1. I'm Jenna Jandreau, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Season 4 of Chebacco Chats is sponsored by Machias Savings Bank. We are grateful for their continued support of our exhibits and programs. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format. So while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to ask whenever a question arises or make a comment whenever you'd like. We will address them at the end of the chat. Today, I'm speaking to Joshua Smith about President Thomas Jefferson's embargo in Frenchman Bay from 1807 to 1809. Josh wrote about this topic in our upcoming edition of Chebacco, the Maritime Edition, which for the first time in Chebacco's history is a collaborative effort with the Great Harbor Maritime Museum. Josh grew up on Cape Cod and coastal Maine. He holds degrees from University of St. Andrews, Maine Maritime Academy, East Carolina University, and the University of Maine. He's the author of Borderland Smuggling, Patriots, Loyalists, and Illicit Trade in the Northeast, 1783 to 1820, which won the John Lyman Award in American Maritime History in 2007, and edited Voyages, Documents in American Maritime History, 1492 to the present, a 2-volume source book in maritime history created in conjunction with the National Maritime Historical Society. He has also written a monograph with a Canadian perspective entitled Battle for the Bay, the Naval War of 1812, published by the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society. Smith lives with his family on Long Island, where he is a professor of humanities at the United States Merchant Marine Academy, as well as director of the American Merchant Marine Museum, both in Kings Point, New York. Welcome, Josh. Thank you for being here. It's so great to have you.
Thank you.
In your biography, I said the word maritime quite a bit. Maritime history is obviously your expertise. What made you decide that you didn't like land history at all?
It's a great question. I think I read history as an undergraduate at St. Andrews in Scotland, and when I came back to this country, I was done with history for the time being. So I did what a lot of New England boys do: is I ran away to sea, and I went to Maine Maritime to get a small Coast Guard license, and I sailed on the schooner Bowdoin to Greenland, and then I worked on small cruise ships and ferry boats in Massachusetts. And then I realized, well, that wasn't taking me where I wanted to go. So I decided, well, hey, I've got a degree in this maritime stuff, and I've got a degree in history. Let's become a maritime historian. And probably also, influenced by growing up in coastal New England, and also by the Patrick O'Brian novels that were such a big deal in the early 90s. And I read all those as fast as I could. So, and it's been a very happy arrangement for me. I studied maritime history at East Carolina University, which is one of the very few places where you can do that in this country. And then I got my PhD at the University of Maine, studying smuggling, mostly down at Passamaquoddy Bay. And unlike a lot of history PhDs, I got hired straight out of my program. Wow, it was a sort of a miracle. I was offered one job in Seguin, Texas, which was lovely. And I was offered this other job just outside of New York City. And I look at my wife, and she who's Korean, and she was not going to go live in the middle of Texas. So I ended up at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, teaching maritime history, and then was given this great opportunity to run their museum as well. So I've just had a really blessed career, actually, studying what I want to study. And when I'm not writing books and studying what I want to study or teaching maritime history, I play with ship models and maritime art. It's just fantastic. If only it were in Maine, I'd be all set. But I guess you can't have it all, So that's my story about being a maritime historian.
That's wonderful. I love how even your hobbies are involving the ships and
it's easy when it's your passion.
exactly. So how did you fall down kind of the rabbit hole that led you to Jefferson's embargo in Frenchman Bay?
Well, it really started actually when I was at Maine Maritime, getting a second undergraduate degree, and I was just fascinated by Castine's history and all these old fortifications and things that are all over the Castine Peninsula. So I started researching that stuff, and I ended up, I don't know, I guess 10 years later or something, I had a master's degree in maritime history, which focused on customs collectors along the coast of Maine. And these are sort of maritime tax collectors and some of the first federal officials in Maine. And I sort of studied that first generation up until statehood, including this guy from Ellsworth named Melatiah Jordan, who was the Frenchman Bay customs collector from 1789 till his death in 1818. And he was a joy to study because, and you'll like this, Jenna, because somebody had transcribed all his correspondence to Washington, D.C. in a really lovely, legible hand. And
how gracious of them.
well, I'll tell you, he made it easy for me to study him, as opposed to say, Penobscot's customs collector who had this horrible crabbed handwriting, and most of his paperwork disappeared when the British invaded in 1814. So because Melatiah Jordan wrote a lot, and because it was transcribed in this lovely hand, you sort of gravitate to that because there are lots of good details and you could figure it out easily. So I've been bumping into Melatiah Jordan now for really 30 years. And he's an interesting character, trying to control Frenchman's Bay and not having so much luck, hence the title of the articles, A Dark and Stormy Night. He goes in pursuit of embargo breakers on a dark and stormy night, but all he has is an open boat, and he has to turn around and return. So that's how I got into Melatiah Jordan. And I've been writing about the embargo for a long time. My very first article as a graduate student was about a murder on Isle La Hoe. No, it's not Frenchman's Bay, but it ain't so far away. And then my doctoral dissertation and first book was really about Passamaquoddy Bay smuggling. And what Melatiah Jordan did sort of in between was all part of that story.
So you have a lot of knowledge of this embargo, but many of us probably don't. So it's June 1807. We're setting the scene here. Thomas Jefferson is halfway through his second term as president. And I'm going to quote from your article now. A British warship off the Virginia coast fired into the American frigate Chesapeake, nearly precipitating a war between Britain and the United States. So I'm going to share my screen, but while I do that, please start us off. What happened next?
So it looks like the United States and Britain are going to go to war, and there've been a lot of issues between the two countries, many of them maritime, impressed sailors, British harassment of American maritime trade, issues out west with Native Americans. So there had been this simmering issue. But President Jefferson understands that this country cannot really afford to go to war with Britain. So while he and Congress do work to build up the army and prepare otherwise, his answer is not to go to war with England, but instead to declare an embargo. And the idea is he is going to punish the British Empire for interfering with American trade by denying all trade to Britain. And this would be sort of like us today saying we're going to punish China by having no trade with China. I mean, right? I mean, we've limited it, but you know, if all of a sudden we turned that spigot off and there were no trade to China, oh my goodness, it would be a different world overnight. And that's the case with Jefferson's embargo as well. And Maine is very vulnerable to this because Maine in 1808 had a very export-based economy, mostly timber. And everything sort of relies on this ability to export stuff to who? Well, mostly to the British, actually. And so when Jefferson imposes this embargo, it really crushes Maine coastal communities. And, you know, initially people try to, you know, you be good citizens and you'll play along with it. But as the embargo drags on and people's purses empty, and then they've got no food in their pantries, and this includes people on Mount Desert Island, they find they have to start breaking the embargo. So it's a funny kind of smuggling, because usually you think of smuggling as people smuggling things into the country, but embargo breaking is the opposite. It's people engaging in trade with the British, and so smuggling their lumber or flour or other goods out of the country. And so officials like Melatiah Jordan find themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to prevent American ships from sailing to foreign markets. And it doesn't work very well. And a lot of people get very, very angry with him, and he will write quite eloquently to Washington complaining about his problems, and because he repeatedly confronts armed mobs in various ports around the periphery of Frenchman's Bay, and calling up the militia to support him. And sometimes he's successful, and sometimes he's not. And this is an issue that starts dividing neighbor from neighbor, in that you get some people who are like, we must support the president, and other people saying, to heck with the president, I got kids to feed. I have to get my timber to market somehow. And they will, you know, sail illegally on a dark and stormy night, typically, to evade patrols, so that they can, you know, somehow support their families. So that's sort of the story of the embargo. And it, you know, people like Paul Dudley Sargent of Sullivan will write letters to President Jefferson during this time, you know, complaining about the amount of smuggling out of Frenchman's Bay, and with the result that President Jefferson himself identifies Frenchman's Bay, and I guess we're supposed to say Frenchman, not Frenchmen's these days. I'm unsure about the exact terminology.
Frenchman Bay is the current way to refer to it.
Of course,
but you can say Frenchman's for it, because in that time it was referred to as Frenchman's Bay, correct?
And that's
in some documents. Okay.
I'm buried in those documents. So my point is, though, is that President Thomas Jefferson writes that Frenchman's Bay is this center of, and here I quote, moral and political depravity. Yeah, you Hancock County people are just awful. I grew up in
Morally
Lincoln County.
depraved.
Uh, but yeah, moral and political depravity up there on Frenchman's Bay. Who knew? And certainly, Melatiah Jordan would agree with that assessment, although he really disliked Paul Dudley Sargent of Sullivan because they had opposing politics and they had a long-standing feud, which is why we can't always believe this guy Paul Dudley Sargent, because he hates Melatiah Jordan so much, and he really wants to replace him as customs collector, and he writes letters to Washington constantly saying, I'm not trying to get his job, but you should fire this guy. And if you needed somebody to replace him, I'm here.
How convenient.
Yeah, so he's not exactly disinterested in it. And
my question is, did he understand what Jordan's role was, what his job was, and how big his territory was? How much area he had to cover with his work?
Yeah, I think he does, because Paul Dudley Sargent is actually a Hancock County judge. He spends a lot of time in Castine, and he's a former colonel in the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. He's a smart guy, but he's also broke, and he really would like to have that steady income that Melatiah Jordan has. And they had a falling out in the 1790s, and it looks like Paul Dudley Sargent's son-in-law was involved in some smuggling, and actually Paul Dudley Sargent got busted smuggling down in the Caribbean by a British naval officer. You might be familiar with this name, Horatio Nelson, as in Trafalgar Square in London, the statue on top of the 80-foot plinth, the hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, was busting Frenchman's Bay smugglers down in Antigua.
That's amazing. Before he was overlooking lots of pigeons in Trafalgar Square.
That's right. And Horatio Nelson already didn't like Americans, and bumping into smuggler Americans like Paul Dudley Sargent didn't help. So
what we have here is the Frenchman's Bay Collection District, and so Jordan had to take his open rowboat, I believe it's referred to. And what was his job? How is he coming up against this embargo, like left and right?
Well, his primary job is really to collect taxes on ships that come into the port. And this is based out of what is called a customs house. Now, Jordan lives in Ellsworth, well up the Union River, where you weren't getting big ships. And there's this sort of enduring mystery of where he kept his custom house. And we've got some comments from Paul Dudley Sargent complaining about it, because it looks like that Jordan's custom house is either at the very tip of Trenton or at the very tip of Newbury Neck, which of course is in the very westernmost part of the district, whereas you've got Somme Sound and Cranberry Isles and Gouldsboro, and there's a whole lot of Frenchman's Bay, and Jordan's base is all the way at the western side of this. Again, we're not exactly sure, and he only has one open rowboat to patrol this till the end of the embargo. At the end of the embargo, he's allowed to rent a local schooner that he arms to patrol the Mount Desert area. And I think that schooner is based mostly around Mount Desert. It certainly goes into Otter Creek, and it goes into what we now call Bar Harbor as well. It's unusual to find records of these rented patrol vessels, but thanks to court records that I found down in Massachusetts, we have some details about some of the clashes they have with these embargo breakers. But it's a huge area, absolutely enormous to patrol with a 20-foot rowboat, which I assume has a mast, so you could sail it some, but it's a very, very big area.
And I saw reference to the Cranberry Isles harbors surrounding them as being very commodious to smugglers. And I'm going to bring up an image of that.
Okay.
What exactly does that mean? What made this area and Frenchman's Bay very commodious to smugglers?
Well, it's for sailors, Mount Desert is very important because it's a landfall. You can see Mount Desert very far out to sea. It's one of two really important landfalls in Maine, the other one being Mount Agamenticus down in York County. So if you can see Mount Desert, you kind of know where you are. And one of the places where ships trading up and down the coast often stopped was in the harbor between the Cranberry Isles, which was wonderfully sheltered. You've got this fellow, Samuel Hadlock, who sets up a pier there and a warehouse. And so you can get supplies there. Oh, and it's really far from the prying eyes of Melatiah Jordan, who complains about it a lot, Cranberry Isles, but there isn't a whole lot he can do about it with only one rowboat for the whole area. So it's a good harbor, a great place to anchor, and you can meet other ships there and shift stuff from one ship to another without prying eyes being around.
That's interesting. I didn't really think about it in that way. Like it's so far away from his kind of home base, wherever that mysterious location might be. It makes it a good spot when the cat's away, right?
Right, and of course, all the fog on the coast of Maine. A fisherman from Lubeck once told me when he was a kid and out on a fishing boat, it's a foggy day, and the guy running the boat says, what do you see out there? And all you can see is fog. And the kid doesn't know what to say. And the fisherman says, opportunity.
Oh, just don't talk about it because your voice will carry.
Right?
So I encourage our audience to check out Joshua's article in Chebacco, which will be coming out in late April. And because we have word count limits in our articles, sometimes we can't fit everything we'd like into it as a Chebacco author. So I would like to know, is there anything that you weren't able to include in the article that you'd like to bring up now?
Oh my goodness. So much. I didn't write about the War of 1812, which I've just written a book about Maine and the War of 1812, because I kind of have too much information and I'd never be able to jam it into an article for Chebacco. But there were really big smuggling incidents around Frenchman's Bay and on Cranberry Isles, which sort of made a fortune for Melatiah Jordan. He helped break up a smuggling ring. And as a result, he built a big house for his son in Ellsworth, which is now the Ellsworth Public Library. So, yeah, that's right. So smuggling kind of built that house, or at least chasing smugglers. And
wow. Very cool.
Yeah, and really very crazy incidents. So there is a Portland privateer in the War of 1812 actually sails to the Far East, to Southeast Asia, and it captures some large British ships called Indiamen, sort of the largest class of merchant ship, carrying a priceless cargo, and they put a crew on it and they send it back to Maine. Actually, two of these ships, both of which get recaptured right in the waters around Mount Desert Island. And in one of these, the British ship is sort of anchored, I think, at Cranberry Islands, and it sees this ship that should not be in this part of the world. It's this ship that's from India, essentially, sail by. And they're like, well, that's curious. let's go chase it. And they board it, only to find that the American privateersmen had fled. And as the British sailors pour up the sides of the ship on both sides at once, they actually end up firing on each other in the dark, wounding their own captain. But who do they find on this British Indiaman? Lascars. Lascars are South Asian sailors. So these are probably some of the first South Asians to ever see Mount Desert. And they'd sailed all the way from, not very far from Singapore, all the way to Mount Desert when they finally get recaptured. Now think about those poor privateersmen from Portland. They almost got it back. If they could have gotten into Union River just a couple more miles, but no, the Royal Navy captures them in the last couple miles, and they don't make a fortune off this. And I think there are actually two of these ships that happens to. So there's a crazy story for you.
Wow. Yeah.
or a Russian brig, a Russian ship, right? You never see Russian ships on the Maine coast back then. Shows up and it sort of anchors off MDI for a couple weeks, and the American officer who comes out to visit them, who works for Melitaya Jordan, is Samuel Hadlock. And he sort of gets involved in these testimonies of, well, hey, what is the ship doing here? It's very strange that a Russian ship is on this coast. And eventually he's able to coax out of the mate of the ship that they are up to mischief, that they are, in fact, engaged in illicit trade, smuggling. And the ship will get arrested and there will be a federal court case. So, yeah, are there more stories to tell? Oh, yeah. Many, many more stories.
Yeah, that could fill almost a whole Chebacco on its own.
Just about.
And is that is some of that in your new book, Making Maine?
It is. So, some of it is in there. I might end up writing another article for you guys at some point where we can explore this stuff, because it is pretty interesting, and the British are all around MDI quite a lot, because again, this idea that it is a landfall, it means it's this easily recognizable landmark that they use. And so very often there are orders, there might be a patrol ship out of St. John, New Brunswick, will say you can operate between the Bay of Fundy and Mount Desert Island, because everybody knows what Mount Desert Island looks like. It's very distinctive.
Well, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I invite our audience to ask questions through the chat box at the bottom of their Zoom screens. I have received some already, so let me stop sharing my screen here. And if you're raising your hand, please enter your question or your comment in the chat box, because in webinar format, we can't see or hear our audience. So the first question that I had was, why would the British, and in parentheses it says Nelson, want to stop American smugglers selling goods to British citizens?
Well, this is in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. So the British are quite surly that they lost the Revolutionary War. And one of their responses is, well, fine, you be independent, but we're going to deny you access to British markets, including the West Indies, places like Barbados, Antigua, and places like that, which is all very nice and theoretical to say in London, but the people of Barbados and Antigua really need things from the United States, and that could be flour or cattle or timber. They really need lumber and timber from Maine because those islands have no trees on them at this point. They are completely covered in sugar cane. So they have no local source of wood. So Paul Dudley Sargent goes down there and defies the British law to do this. Now the locals love it because they need this stuff. And Nelson finds himself threatened by locals, or that legal authorities won't assist him in seizing Dudley's ship. And he's actually afraid that a mob is going to seize Dudley's schooner back from him. So the British colonists in the West Indies, they want the American goods and encourage them. It's the British imperial government and the Royal Navy that's trying to stop it. And the locals have ways of tormenting those naval officers. And they torment Nelson pretty good, and he doesn't do very well. He gets very, very frustrated operating the Caribbean. He's much better in a battle with the French than he is dealing with smugglers. He just doesn't have the nuance. He doesn't have those skills to sort of charm the people and say, well, you should really obey the law, no matter how harsh it seems.
So what exactly would the penalty have been for if you got caught smuggling? What were you looking at for a sentence? Was it minimal enough that it seemed obvious to take on that risk, or was it?
So the punishments are financial by and large. So if you had any kind of boat, you had to post a bond, triple the value of the boat and its cargo before you sailed anywhere. So the first thing that's going to happen is if you get caught smuggling is that bond gets seized and you find yourself out of a lot of money. And then government lawyers can then prosecute you in other ways as well for there are fines associated as well. So it can ruin you financially is the primary way it's going to do it. Now, when things get more serious, when a customs official gets murdered on Isle of Ho, that character, a guy named John McMasters, goes to jail. And actually, he ends up in the Lincoln County Jail in Wiscasset, which is still there, the big old grim granite prison. And he will be there until 1817 or so, from 1809. So for many, many years, they don't really know what to do with him until actually he gets murdered in the jail by a fellow inmate. But yeah, usually it's civil fines that catch up with you, if they can find you. And a lot of these guys run away.
Right. And maybe if your livelihood is already at stake because you can't trade, it's, financial ruin up against financial ruin, the risk of one versus the other.
Well, it's a gamble. That's it.
Right.
But if you can get your ship out to, say, Halifax or Bermuda or the Bahamas, it's like hitting the lottery because prices are very high because nothing's getting to those places. So, there's a calculation there. Is it worth the risk? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. Others get caught. There's a guy who's unloading flour barrels in Eden, which is now Bar Harbor, and he claims unwittingly he was involved in a smuggling operation because that flour later disappears and ends up in British markets. And he pleads, "Oh, I'm just a fisherman from MDI. What do I know?" And that seems to do the trick, and he does get pardoned. I'm not sure I buy it myself, but yeah. So there are ways the locals try to mitigate this if they can plead for mercy.
Yeah. So I have one comment here or one question about the crab trees of Hancock. Any information on the crab trees of Hancock? Have they popped up in your research?
Well, probably. I'd have to check. I've got a big database, and I can check names if you connect me to the person who asked that. But that sounds like a familiar name to me. So I'll check it out if you can connect me to that person.
It's our good friend Bill Horner here at the Historical Society. So I will certainly follow up and connect you two about that. So I had a comment from Holly McComber. She's also a historian, and she said something about Jordan's residence. She has a note that he didn't reside at either the tip of Newbury Neck or Weymouth Point.
Well, my first point is, hi, Holly. By the way, I pulled a dirty trick on her. She is mentioned in the credits for this article coming out. So
she sure is. That's why I said she's a fellow historian. We have to bring up her chat. So she may have commented here. Captain.
Yeah, Holly knows where all the bodies are buried. So she's right. Jordan lives in downtown Ellsworth, and I don't think his house exists anymore. But the question is, where does he keep his customs house? And I think that's in either Newbury Neck or Weymouth Point. I don't know, and we haven't gotten solid evidence yet of where that is. That's addressed a little bit in the article.
So he didn't work from home. He wasn't a work from homer.
No, well, I think he had a deputy who pretty much kept the customs house for him, and he probably stuck pretty close to Ellsworth when he could. He had a lot of other business interests locally. I mean, Jordan's a pretty big name in the great state of Maine.
Well, it's good to know he had some help with that big job of his.
Yeah.
So Holly also commented about Crabtree, and she said, let me scroll up here. Captain Agreen, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Agreen, Crabtree, was a privateer in Sullivan Hancock. So she added that note. And then I have a question. Do you have any documentation of Passamaquoddy involved in any of these events in Passamaquoddy Bay, I believe?
So they're certainly around, and they're certainly very interested observers watching all this sort of frantic smuggling activity. They don't seem to get involved in it themselves, although they aren't above selling a canoe or two to a smuggler, and you can sort of get one barrel of flour in a canoe, but that you can make a lot of money that way. So no, they seem to stay clear of it. The Penobscots as well, when Castine is occupied during the War of 1812, sort of don't get involved in trade, but they do come down and visit Castine, and they start talking about, hey, we've got fur pelts, we'd like to sell them to you, and the British express some interest, but then a few weeks later, the war ends and the British evacuate in April, so it never really happens. So the Native Americans are certainly around, and there's a lovely painting of a Passamaquoddy during the War of 1812 in Fort Sullivan in Eastport. It's just a fantastic portrait of a young woman in traditional dress. That is one of my favorites.
So we have Bill chimed in. Yes, green Crabtree, related to my friend, privateer, but probably later in War of 1812. Thank you, Bill. And then I have a question from Marie Yarbrough, who's the curator at Acadia National Park. Before the collection districts were organized and staffed in 1789, were there any other mechanisms or similar mechanisms for patrolling this coast in this way, keeping track of goods, trade, and those coming and going earlier?
There were, and this is before the Constitution is written. So we're still under those Articles of Confederation. I'm sure we're all having flashbacks to 8th grade now and thinking about how unhappy studying that stuff made you. But so there are no federal customs officers, but the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has what are called naval officers. This has nothing to do with the Navy and ships with guns and stuff. It's sort of an old medieval term having to do with trade. And these naval officers are supposed to control and tax local trade. And they haven't been studied much. Many of these would actually roll over and become federal customs collectors after the Constitution went into effect. That doesn't seem to be the case in Frenchman's Bay. I think there was somebody else, and I don't know who that is off the top of my hat. I do know that there was a lot of smuggling in that period, and the naval officers were not very effective, and there were some sort of riots and unhappiness in Castine, and the Castine Historical Society has a really wonderful letter book from one of these naval officers that might give you a clue. But Maine was part of Massachusetts, and I think there's an awful lot of work to be done in the Commonwealth's archives down in Boston. There's a lot of details down there that we don't know, and that would be nice to know. Like Hancock County's first sheriff, whose name escapes me, he didn't stick around after statehood. He went back to Massachusetts, where he was living in Western Massachusetts, and he tried to sell a free Black woman into slavery for $600. Oh, yeah, right. The horror, right? I mean, what a miserable human being, to take a free person and sell them into slavery for $600. Really disgusting. So, and this is the sort of stories that are down there in Boston, just waiting for us to dig them up and present them in some sort of informative way.
Okay, well, that's a challenge to all you community historians in the Boston area or looking for, maybe, do they have a digitized
They've got,
collection?
yeah, they're getting there. There's, I think it's called Digital Commonwealth or something like that. And they've got a lot of sources available there, and they're getting there slowly. I don't think the Massachusetts Archives is being particularly aggressive in digitizing, but they're getting there slowly. But hey, all you folks in Maine, you all need an excuse to go to Boston, right?
There's many good reasons to go to Boston.
Absolutely.
So one other question that came in is, how much did Jordan exactly make from finding these smugglers?
I'd have to dig into my notes, but tens of thousands of dollars. And he worked together with Castine's customs collector, who had captured all these coded documents revealing a big smuggling scheme. And the Castine customs collector realized this was bigger than him, so he signed an agreement with Melatiah Jordan, even though the two were of opposite politics and probably didn't like each other very much. They make a deal, along with Jeremiah O'Brien, who's the customs collector up in Machias, and they had this deal: we're going to capture these smugglers collectively, and we will share the rewards we get from it equally, no matter if it gets caught mostly in one district or another. So they all pitch in together, and Jordan makes tens of thousands of dollars. He does very well out of this, and he builds the Ellsworth Public Library from the funds.
So is that 10,000 or thousands of dollars in that era, or thousands of dollars relative to our? I know we sometimes offer up what that would be with the inflation rate.
So it's tens of thousands of dollars in $1815.
Okay.
It's a lot,
It's a lot of money.
lot
Okay.
of money. And finally, Jordan is sort of a made man. He and his wife had, I can't remember how many children, but it was double digits. God bless her. And so they had a lot of bills. And but I think at the end of his life, and I think he dies in 1818, he is financially secure finally.
Thank you for that. We have the comment from Bill saying, actually, Agreen Crabtree died in 1808, so it was not 1812 that he was involved. Active privateer during the American Revolution. Was there Frenchman's Bay activity during the Revolution?
I don't do the American Revolution, so I'm going to top out.
Okay, well, Bill, I promise you we'll find that answer.
Privateers around in the War of 1812, and of course the Royal Navy was around, and there was a battle in, what was it, Norwood's Cove, right? Which I think, was it Bill
Yes.
who wrote about that, right?
Tim Garrity is, perhaps Bill did too, but I do know that Tim Garrity has done a lot of research on Norwood Cove and some of the activity there. So we'll have to follow up with our good friends in our history community to get an answer for Bill. We put you on the spot. Thank you. So Josh, that's the end of our questions. And I thank you for giving us some extra time to answer those. And I thank our audience for engaging with us in this way and learning more about this topic. So thank you so much, Josh, for being here.
You're welcome. And let me finish with this, because we all like bargains. And I'm not saying you have to buy my book, but it's there in the library. But if you go to the University of Massachusetts website and use the code MAS068, you get 30% off the book. That's capital MAS068. And I know some of you cheap Yankees out there, your heartbeat is just increased, by twofold with the idea of a bargain. So that's my going away present to you all.
What was the website where you could find that book again?
The University of Massachusetts Press.
Thank you. And the book's name was Making Maine.
Making Maine, Statehood in the War of 1812. And you're going to find a lot of good stories there. It's a very different account than anything you've read before, I can guarantee it.
And we did have somebody ask about library copies. So I encourage you to look at your local libraries to see if they have a copy of Josh's book. And if they don't, encourage your circulation desk to pick one up. Thanks for being here, Josh. It was a real pleasure to have you. And I look forward to hopefully talking with you again about more of this maritime history that you love so much.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great fun.
Great. So coming up on Chebacco Chats next week, Thursday, March 9 at 4:30 p.m., I will be presenting about life-saving and the establishment of the Coast Guard on MDI. Chebacco Chats are available to view on our website the week after they air. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at MDI History to be notified when we upload them. Our journal, Chebacco, the Maritime Edition, is currently in production and will be delivered to members' mailboxes in late April. You can become a member or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org. I hope everyone has a really good evening. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.